February 1971. The jungles along the Laotian border were about to witness one of the most ambitious and disastrous operations of the entire Vietnam War. For years, the Ho Chi Minh Trail had been the lifeline of the North Vietnamese war effort, a sprawling network of hidden jungle routes stretching through Laos and Cambodia, funneling weapons, troops, and supplies into South Vietnam. No matter how many bombs the Americans dropped, no matter how many raids were launched, the trail endured. And by 1971, the United States was running out of time. President Richard Nixon had promised the American people that U.S. combat troops would be coming home. His strategy, known as Vietnamization, meant South Vietnam's army, the ARVN, would take over the fighting. To prove they were ready, South Vietnam would have to strike deep into enemy territory without American ground troops beside them. The target, Laos. The mission, to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail once and for all. It was called Operation Lam Son 719. On paper, it looked like the perfect test of Vietnamization. 20,000 ARVN troops, backed by hundreds of U.S. helicopters, artillery, and B-52 bombers, would drive across the border, smash through enemy positions, and destroy the supply network that had kept the war alive. Success would prove that South Vietnam could stand on its own. Failure was unthinkable. But what began as a bold offensive quickly spiraled into chaos. ARVN units bogged down. North Vietnamese forces struck back with overwhelming ferocity. Helicopter after helicopter fell from the sky in flames. And what was meant to showcase South Vietnam's strength ended as a brutal demonstration of its weakness. This is the story of Operation Lam Son 719, the invasion of Laos that Nixon hoped would save his strategy and instead exposed its fatal flaws. By early 1971, the Vietnam War had dragged on for more than a decade, and the United States was desperate to find a way out. American casualties were mounting, anti-war protests were growing louder back home, and the political cost of continuing the fight was becoming unbearable. President Richard Nixon needed a plan that would reduce American involvement without simply handing victory to North Vietnam. The answer was Vietnamization. Announced in 1969, the strategy promised that the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, would gradually take over combat responsibilities while U.S. troops withdrew. In theory, South Vietnam would be trained, equipped, and motivated enough to defend itself, while America's role shifted to air support, supplies, and advisors. But there was one problem: the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This sprawling network of jungle roads, paths, tunnels, and hidden supply lines stretched from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia, feeding men and weapons directly into South Vietnam. It was the enemy's lifeline, and despite years of bombing, it was still fully operational. As long as the trail flowed, North Vietnam could continue the war indefinitely. For Nixon, this was more than a military issue, it was political. He needed proof that Vietnamization was working, proof that South Vietnam's army could carry the fight on its own. For President Nguyen Van Thieu in Saigon, the stakes were equally high. His regime had to show the South Vietnamese people and the world that ARVN was no longer dependent on American ground troops. The plan was bold and risky. South Vietnamese forces would cross into Laos, a country officially neutral but heavily infiltrated by the North Vietnamese army. The mission: cut the trail, destroy PAVN supply bases, and cripple enemy logistics. There was one catch. By U.S. law, American ground troops could not cross into Laos. That meant the entire ground offensive would rest on ARVN's shoulders. The United States could provide helicopters, artillery, airstrikes, and logistics, but no combat boots on Laotian soil. This was the gamble of Operation Lam Son 719. To test Vietnamization, not in a controlled environment, but in one of the most hostile and unforgiving battlefields of the entire war. If ARVN succeeded, it would prove that Nixon's strategy was viable, and South Vietnam could defend itself. If it failed, the entire foundation of Vietnamization would collapse, right in front of the world. On paper, Operation Lam Son 719 had a clear set of objectives. At its core, it was designed to strike directly at the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the lifeline of North Vietnam's war machine. For years, this hidden highway of men and munitions had frustrated the United States. Despite the most intense bombing campaign in history, the trail continued to function, absorbing punishment, rerouting through new paths, and funneling more fighters into the South. Cutting it was the dream of every American commander. Now that mission fell to South Vietnam. The plan called for 20,000 ARVN troops to cross into southern Laos along Route 9. Their mission? 1. Destroy enemy supply depots and logistics hubs that fed the trail. 2. Seize and hold key sections of the route, severing North Vietnam's ability to reinforce its forces in the south. 3. Prove ARVN's offensive capability, demonstrating that Vietnamization was not just theory, but reality. The U.S. role would be massive but limited. Over 600 helicopters, from slick Hueys to heavy-lift Chinooks and deadly Cobra gunships, would provide air mobility. American artillery batteries near the border would offer constant fire support. B-52 bombers and fighter bombers would saturate the battlefield, but there would be no American infantry on the ground in Laos. By law, this was ARVN's fight alone. For President Thieu, the stakes were personal. A victory in Laos would show his people that South Vietnam's army was no longer dependent on American ground forces. For Nixon, the stakes were global. A successful Lam Son 719 would prove to the American public and to the world that Vietnamization was working, and U.S. withdrawal could continue without fear of collapse. But these objectives came with dangerous assumptions. The planners believed ARVN could move quickly, strike hard, and withdraw before North Vietnamese forces could react in strength. They assumed the PAVN would not commit major forces deep in Laos, and they trusted that air power could compensate for ARVN's weaknesses. They were wrong. The planners of Operation Lam Son 719 envisioned a swift, aggressive strike, but the forces assembled on both sides reveal why the operation was destined for bloodshed. Army of the Republic of Vietnam. The ground assault into Laos would be carried out entirely by ARVN. Roughly 20,000 soldiers were assigned to the mission, drawn from some of South Vietnam's best formations. The 1st Infantry Division, seasoned from battles in northern provinces. The Airborne Division, elite paratroopers known for discipline and mobility. The Marine Division, among the toughest units ARVN possessed. The 1st Armored Brigade, with American-supplied M41 tanks and M113 armored personnel carriers. Several Ranger groups, light infantry specialists in counterinsurgency. On paper, this was South Vietnam's finest, but beneath the surface, problems lurked. ARVN's leadership was riddled with political appointments. Many officers lacked combat initiative, and morale was shaky, especially when facing an enemy on foreign soil. United States support. While no American ground troops could cross into Laos, U.S. support was immense. Over 600 helicopters from the 101st Airborne and other aviation units would lift, supply, and cover ARVN troops. Gunships like the AH-1 Cobra prowled the skies, while Hueys ferried soldiers into landing zones under fire. Artillery batteries along the border pounded suspected enemy positions. Above it all, the thunder of B-52 bombers delivered carpet strikes, while F-4 Phantoms and A-1 Sky Raiders swooped low to strafe. American logistics kept the offensive alive, and American air crews took staggering risks to sustain it. People's Army of Vietnam facing ARVN were 40,000 to 60,000 North Vietnamese troops, many already dug in across southern Laos. These were no guerrillas, they were regular soldiers, hardened by years of fighting. The PAVN deployed entire divisions. The 304th and 308th Divisions, veterans of major battles. The 320th Division, tasked with blocking Route 9. The 2nd Division, positioned deeper along the trail. They were backed by Soviet-supplied tanks, T-54s, PT-76, long-range artillery, and, most dangerously, dense anti-aircraft networks of 23mm and 37mm guns, surface-to-air missiles. For U.S. pilots, Laos became a killing ground. Clashing strategies. ARVN's plan: drive quickly along Route 9, set up fire bases, destroy supply caches, and withdraw before the PAVN could organize. PAVN's counter-plan: lure ARVN deeper into Laos, stretch their supply lines, then unleash overwhelming counterattacks with artillery, armor, and ambushes. It was a contest between mobility and firepower versus discipline and preparation. The South Vietnamese hoped to demonstrate independence. The North Vietnamese sought to prove the opposite. The battlefield was set, and what unfolded would test not only the strength of armies, but the very idea of Vietnamization itself. Phase 1. Crossing into Laos. At dawn on February 8th, the operation began. ARVN armored columns rolled west along Route 9, the only real highway slicing toward Laos. Behind them, waves of American helicopters lifted airborne troops toward hastily prepared landing zones. The plan was ambitious: establish fire bases inside Laos, secure Route 9, and drive deeper to sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail. For a brief moment, everything seemed to go smoothly. Fire bases were established along the border, supply lines extended, and ARVN commanders reported early successes. But the deeper ARVN moved, the more resistance stiffened. Phase 2. The PAVN countermoves. The North Vietnamese had been waiting. For months they had anticipated just such an invasion, and their response was swift. By mid-February, entire PAVN divisions began closing in on the advancing ARVN columns. Tanks rumbled through jungle tracks, artillery rained down, and ambushes erupted along the highway. The skies turned into a battlefield. U.S. helicopters, essential for mobility and resupply, flew into a storm of anti-aircraft fire. Entire platoons were pinned down as gunships darted low, exchanging rockets with hidden enemy batteries. Helicopter after helicopter spiraled out of the sky, hit by withering flak. Phase 3. Deep into the trap, ARVN airborne and Ranger units pushed farther west, establishing outposts like Firebase 31 and Firebase 30 deep inside Laos. But these positions were precarious. Isolated under constant bombardment, they quickly became magnets for PAVN assaults. Firebase 31 became the scene of a nightmare. Surrounded by superior enemy forces, its defenders endured relentless artillery and infantry assaults. Requests for reinforcement went unanswered. Helicopters could not land under such intense fire. Finally, PAVN tanks rolled in. Overrun, the survivors broke and fled. The fall of Firebase 31 was a devastating psychological blow. Phase 4. The battle for the skies. If ARVN was to survive, American helicopters had to keep flying. Pilots of the 101st Airborne, Marine squadrons, and Army aviation units carried out one of the most dangerous missions of the war. They flew constant resupply and evacuation sorties into hot LZs, where enemy guns waited. The cost was staggering. In just 6 weeks, over 100 helicopters were destroyed and more than 600 damaged. Pilots joked grimly that Lam Son 719 stood for Laos, some of none. For those who flew, it was no joke. Casualties mounted daily. Phase 5. The turning point. By late February, ARVN's advance had stalled. The PAVN poured more divisions into Laos, overwhelming South Vietnamese units. Supply lines back to Khe Sanh were choked by ambushes. ARVN commanders began to realize the truth. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. President Thieu, fearing disaster, ordered a withdrawal. But retreat under fire was no easy task. Entire units had to fight their way back along Route 9, harried every step by PAVN artillery, tanks, and infantry. Phase 6. The chaotic withdrawal, March 1971. The withdrawal quickly devolved into chaos. Some ARVN units broke under pressure, abandoning equipment and fleeing toward the border. Others fought desperately to hold positions long enough for helicopters to extract survivors. The scenes were harrowing. Helicopters overloaded with panicked soldiers barely lifted off, bullets tearing through their fuselages. On the ground, ARVN infantry clung to skids, begging not to be left behind. American pilots risked everything, returning again and again to pluck men from collapsing fire bases. Firebase Lolo, Firebase Delta, and others fell one by one. Each evacuation turned into a battle of survival. In one infamous incident, dozens of ARVN soldiers clung to a helicopter until it crashed, unable to lift the weight. Phase 7. Back across the border. By early March, the survivors straggled back into South Vietnam. The invasion had lasted barely 6 weeks. The cost was catastrophic. ARVN lost thousands of men, much of its armor, and the illusion of strength. The Ho Chi Minh Trail remained intact, bloodied but unbroken. For the North Vietnamese, Lam Son 719 was a triumph. They had not only defended their lifeline, but humiliated the ARVN in front of the world. The human face of the battle. What made Lam Son 719 unforgettable were the images. Film footage of ARVN soldiers clinging to helicopter skids, helicopters bursting into flames mid-air, and shattered units limping back across the border told a story no press release could hide. U.S. advisors described scenes of panic, units refusing to advance, officers abandoning positions, entire battalions collapsing under fire. For many Americans, this raised the question: if South Vietnam's best troops could not hold against the North Vietnamese in Laos, how could they ever stand alone? Operation Lam Son 619 had begun as a test of Vietnamization. It ended as its funeral. ARVN's weaknesses, poor leadership, fragile morale, and dependence on U.S. air power, were laid bare for all to see. What was supposed to be a bold demonstration of independence had instead become a sobering reminder. South Vietnam could not win this war without America's boots on the ground. Every battle has its price. For Operation Lam Son 719, the cost was staggering. By the end of the operation, ARVN had suffered an estimated 7,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. Entire battalions were shattered, and many of South Vietnam's best-trained units returned as broken shells of their former selves. The 1st Armored Brigade lost dozens of tanks and armored vehicles. Airborne and Ranger battalions, once elite strike forces, were decimated. Worse than the numbers was the psychological toll. Morale collapsed. Soldiers had been ordered to prove their independence, but many returned humiliated, convinced they could not stand without U.S. ground troops beside them. Although no U.S. infantry fought in Laos, the Americans paid heavily in the skies. More than 100 helicopters were destroyed and over 600 damaged. The casualty count included over 100 killed and several hundred wounded, mostly air crews. For aviation units, Lam Son 719 was one of the deadliest campaigns of the war. Estimates of PAVN losses vary wildly, ranging from 8,000 to 13,000 casualties. But the key fact remains: despite their losses, the North Vietnamese achieved their objective. The Ho Chi Minh Trail not only survived, it continued to function as the artery of their war effort. Strategically, Lam Son 719 was a failure. ARVN did not cut the trail, did not destroy PAVN bases, and did not prove Vietnamization worked. Instead, the operation exposed ARVN's weaknesses: poor leadership, fragile morale, and heavy reliance on American firepower. For the United States, the results were equally grim. Nixon had hoped for a political victory to justify continued withdrawal. Instead, the images of burning helicopters and fleeing soldiers told a different story, one of chaos and defeat. For the North Vietnamese, Lam Son 719 was a triumph. They had stood toe-to-toe with South Vietnam's best troops, backed by American air power, and forced them into retreat. It was proof that victory was only a matter of time. When the dust settled over Laos, Operation Lam Son 719 was already being judged, not just on the battlefield, but in the political arena, and the verdicts could not have been more divided. President Nguyen Van Thieu tried desperately to frame the operation as a success. In speeches, he boasted that ARVN had inflicted massive casualties on the enemy, destroyed supply bases, and proven it could conduct large-scale operations without American infantry. Official reports from Saigon emphasized the high body counts of North Vietnamese soldiers and the destruction of supply depots. But within ARVN ranks, the mood was far darker. Soldiers who returned spoke of chaos, poor leadership, and near disaster. Many officers had shown little initiative under fire, waiting for orders that never came. Troops had panicked during the withdrawal, with some abandoning positions and equipment. The supposed success looked hollow to those who had survived the ordeal. For President Nixon, Lam Son 719 was supposed to be the proof that Vietnamization worked, a propaganda victory to show Americans that their allies could stand on their own. Instead, the images told a different story. Television footage of ARVN troops clinging desperately to helicopter skids, of abandoned vehicles littering Route 9, and of shattered battalions limping back across the border contradicted the official line. Journalists described the operation as a fiasco. Even sympathetic commentators admitted that South Vietnam had failed to achieve its goals. In Congress, critics of the war seized on Lam Son 719 as evidence that Vietnamization was doomed. If ARVN's best units, with massive U.S. air support, could not succeed in Laos, how could they ever defend their own country without American combat troops? For the North Vietnamese, Lam Son 719 was celebrated as a major victory. Propaganda broadcasts proclaimed that the puppet army of South Vietnam had been crushed. The People's Army of Vietnam had defended the Ho Chi Minh Trail and inflicted staggering losses on their enemies. Strategically, the PAVN emerged stronger. Their supply lines through Laos remained intact, and their morale soared. They had proven that even against ARVN's best troops and overwhelming U.S. air power, they could stand firm. The consequences rippled far beyond the battlefield. For the United States, Lam Son 719 accelerated the sense of futility. Nixon pressed ahead with troop withdrawals, but with growing doubts about whether South Vietnam could ever survive alone. For South Vietnam, the operation shattered confidence. Many ARVN soldiers no longer trusted their commanders or their own ability to fight. For the North Vietnamese, Lam Son 719 confirmed what they had long believed. Time was on their side. If ARVN could collapse in 6 weeks in Laos, what would happen when the Americans were gone for good? History is often shaped less by what leaders claim and more by what the world sees. And what the world saw in Operation Lam Son 719 was not strength, it was collapse. For South Vietnam, the operation was a crushing blow to morale and credibility. Lam Son 719 had been intended as a showcase of ARVN's ability to wage independent war. Instead, it revealed a force plagued by fragile leadership, poor coordination, and limited endurance. These were South Vietnam's best troops, airborne, Marines, Rangers, and armored brigades, and they had faltered when asked to lead. If the elite units could not succeed, what hope did the regular infantry divisions have? For the United States, Lam Son 719 struck at the very heart of Nixon's Vietnamization policy. The entire premise was that South Vietnam could defend itself with U.S. support limited to the skies. But the operation proved otherwise. Despite overwhelming American air power, ARVN could not hold ground without U.S. combat boots alongside them. To many observers in Washington, Lam Son 719 was the clearest evidence yet that South Vietnam could not survive once American forces fully withdrew. For North Vietnam, the operation was confirmation of strategy. The PAVN had absorbed massive losses but had held firm. More importantly, they had humiliated their enemy in front of the global stage. The Ho Chi Minh Trail continued to flow with men and supplies, unbroken and unstoppable. The lesson was clear. If ARVN could not destroy the trail with American support, they never would. In the long view, historians often describe Lam Son 719 as the beginning of the end for South Vietnam. It did not end the war overnight, but it stripped away illusions. From that point forward, the U.S. and Saigon both knew, whether they admitted it or not, that Vietnamization was built on sand. The legacy of Lam Son 719 is not just a military defeat, but a symbol of the limits of training, technology, and air power when the fighting spirit of an army is uncertain. It was a test South Vietnam could not pass, and its failure set the stage for the final collapse just 4 years later. Operation Lam Son 719 was supposed to be the turning point. It was meant to prove that South Vietnam's army could carry the fight into enemy territory, that Nixon's strategy of Vietnamization was working, and that the war could be won without American boots on the ground. But instead, it proved the opposite. ARVN's best troops had been thrown into Laos with overwhelming U.S. air support at their back, and they had faltered. Fire bases collapsed, helicopters fell in flames, and retreat turned into chaos. The Ho Chi Minh Trail remained intact, a symbol of North Vietnam's resilience. For South Vietnam, the psychological damage was devastating. For the United States, it was a bitter lesson that no amount of air power could make up for weak allies on the ground. And for North Vietnam, it was proof that time and willpower were on their side. Lam Son 719 wasn't just a failed operation. It was the moment the world saw that Vietnamization was an illusion. What do you think? Was Lam Son 719 doomed from the start? Or could it have worked under different leadership and planning? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more untold battles of the Vietnam War.